Okay, thank you very much for that. Lovely to be here. Hello, everyone. As Justin said, I'm Tom Fleming. And yes, I'm here to talk about the Cities of Culture, or the Capitals of Culture programme, but I'm going to do so after talking about some of the things that you've already been talking about, but from a city or capital of culture lens. Because I think it's important that we situate programmes like Capital of Culture, like the UNESCO Cities of Culture, in a paradigm that it does problematise this notion of the creative city and does look for, I think, an approach that is much more inclusive, much more about local culture and about what works in specific places, and much less boosterish in terms of the way that cities very much race to the bottom when it comes to agendas around culture and creativity, through branding exercises, through market making, through almost intercity beauty contests where cities are trying to say, I'm more creative than you, or I'm more cultural than you, which is not particularly constructive and not something that actually delivers the value that culture and creativity together can offer people, communities, economies, yes, but also that wider sense of place. So I think in some ways we've reached the end of the road when it comes to this notion of the creative city, as we have been applying it in recent years. How many cities currently position themselves as creative cities, or at least prefix their name with the word creative? It's almost countless. There's an industry of creative city making in itself. Too little of it is about local culture. Too much of it is about civic boosterism. And very little of it is about process. It's all about productizing this city rather than understanding that cities are actually layer upon multiple stories, different narratives, different positions. They're political, they're negotiated. And the way that creative cities as an agenda has unfolded means that process, that messiness, is often sanitized to the detriment, ultimately, of sustainable economic development and inclusive social development. So we need to move away from the glossy rhetoric of the creative city, which actually, so much of it is driven in terms of a very narrow focus on attracting, retaining certain kinds of talent, this metropolitan elite, this creative class, as Richard Florida might call it, which is a narrow part of the population, and it's an exclusive part of any population. It's not an inclusive, intercultural, intergenerational demographic. We need to move away from the often misleading agenda around culture-led regeneration, which in many terms is actually about gentrification, property-led, around celebrating the city as a commodity, as a spectacle, about cleaning it up, about diverting gaze away from the things that are more problematic, about quick fixes. We need to move away from this notion of the creative industries itself delivering unbounded growth. Yes, on a macro level, it's a high-growth sector. It's a sector that's growing and has continued to grow through the recession. But it grows differently in different places, and it offers different kinds of value in different contexts. And perhaps we need to think, for example, in a smaller city, around what growth means to us, and what is sustainable, and to develop a creative city agenda on our own terms. And obviously in Italy, you've been doing that for a long time, with thinking around how you converge agendas around economic growth, economic sustainability, well-being, inclusion, and quality of life. So the Creative City agenda, and I think Andy pointed to this when it comes to things like Creative City networks, this isn't about quick fixes. This is not about delivering in the short term through empty rhetoric around how creative you are. It's about building from the many things that constitute the modern city, the small fragments, the diversity, the challenges, the conversations that fizz around the social fabric of a city. Those are the things that ultimately constitute your relative creativity or otherwise. Those are the things where culture sits at the heart of city making as a process, rather than, as it is often the case, to the margins. And those are the things that as well move away from this quite elitist, exclusive notion of the creative industries. If there's one major criticism of the creative economy agenda in recent times, is the way that the global downturn has proven how exclusive it is in terms of how it delivers benefit to cities or to communities. It's a predominantly middle-class sector still. It's a predominantly, if you live in a place which is culturally diverse, it's likely still to be a very white, undiverse sector. And it's a sector where so much progress is made in your career path if you have access to this kind of social capital, to the privileged networks that actually are historically embedded over many generations. It's difficult to enter for people from certain communities without privilege to those networks, without that social capital. And therefore, ultimately, it's a sector that isn't performing to its potential. Because the one thing that the creative economy, however it's understood, is built upon the talent base. It's built upon ideas. It's built upon aspiration. And if the talent base is relatively narrow, then it's not building from the resources that are available to it, and therefore it isn't delivering what it can to a city. So a future creative city is one that has to be much more diverse, intercultural, and to create new identities through the conversation, through the transactions in the city, to create new products, new services built upon the dialogue that interculturalism delivers. Because otherwise, what we have is an exclusive creative city paradigm, and one that actually is inherently contradictory. This quote here suggests that the celebration or the celebratory tone around creativity and creative cities is in fact undermined by the outcomes that process has delivered in many cities. It's undercut by the reality where pluralism, inclusivity, the notion of small independent producers, all of those things are actually not being nurtured in too many places, because people are looking for quick fixes, they're looking for quick branding solutions, and they're not looking for long-term socially embedded solutions. And in some ways they're looking for formula. And I think it's encouraging to hear Andy's points around how the Creative Cities Networks is not about imitating what other cities have done. It's not about copying the best practice. It's about co-creating notions of best practice on your terms in a way that's research and evidence driven, but critically is mobilized by participation by diverse communities in specific contexts. So cities of culture, or European capitals of culture, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the process, but I imagine most of you are familiar a little bit with it, because of course Italy in 2019 will host one of the European capitals of culture, along with Bulgaria. But the Capital of Culture programme, like any endeavour which positions culture and creativity to the heart of a civic project, lives or dies to the extent to which it is something which is inclusive, to the extent to which it is something which goes beyond the search for the prize and actually looks to develop longer-term solutions to city making, but also something that is holistic in a way that culture is understood. Culture is something that connects communities, that inspires new ways of living, new ways of working, and ultimately something that is sustainable. So like in any program which has culture, creativity at its heart, there are as many bad examples as there are good examples. And the worst capitals of culture are those that just go for the big, spectacular cultural programming with the big events and trying to appeal to the international press, and aren't those that actually look for locally embedded approaches to cultural development, and that aren't those that look to work with what they have. And the best capitals of culture, therefore, are those that see the process of development, the years that build up to being a capital of culture, the alignment of a set of histories, a set of memories, a set of strategies that are already in train toward a longer-term process of city-making, where capital of culture is an accelerator and a way of boosting that and adding value to that process. Those are the successful ones, not the ones that are just looking for on-message, evangelical presentations of how cultural and creative they are. The best capitals of culture are those that actually critically reflect on what it means to be in a city, to live in a city, to be from, that provide a sense or a platform for discussing and exploring the possibility of a city, to look for new trajectories, to explore what the future can be, which isn't necessarily just new versions of the past, but actually could be a departure, could be disruptive, and certainly is owned by voices that aren't currently owning the civic agenda. And a capital of culture that works most effectively is one that brings together a set of cultural, economic, educational, community and planning agendas. It isn't just around culture. It isn't just around the arts. It's something that looks across the fabric of city making overall. So what I want to do is just to give an example of what I think is a capital of culture that does all of those things, and that took the capital of culture process to a level in terms of critical engagement with culture and creativity to a level that other capitals of culture have struggled to deliver on. So this is the city of Guimarães in northern Portugal, a city of about 160,000 people, a little bit smaller than Prato, a city with a deep sense of history. It's where the Portuguese nation-state was effectively born. It's a city which, like Prato, has a castle. What great city doesn't have a castle? It has medieval squares, has a cathedral, has all of the things that Justin talked about in terms of what a city constitutes, has beautiful historic public realm. There's a deep sense of history, a real intimacy to the city. A sense, in a way, in the way that the city has positioned itself in recent years, of preservation, of conservation, and of positioning this city as a place of memory, of deep history. But that goes with a set of challenges. You have an incredible cultural tradition, but what about contemporary culture? What about the modern life of the city? Who owns that? Who owns the identity of the city today? Is it the people from previous generations? But it's also a city of production. It's not a city which has got such a long history of production, for example, in textiles as Prato, but it's a textile city. It's renowned in Portugal as a city of textiles, also a city of leather, a city of cutlery, a city of high-quality production. It's set in the DNA of the city in terms of what that city is for. Deep history, medieval culture, textiles, leather, cutlery. But there are challenges there, as there are in Prato, although different challenges. There are challenges around the diversification of that sector. There are challenges around the flexibility of that sector to cope with shifts in production internationally, shifts in technology, shifts in the way that demand is expressing itself all over the world. And there are issues around competitiveness in terms of the wage profile of the sector, in terms of the skill profile of the sector, and in terms of other places that are critically reviewing their role in economic value chains, that are actually developing new products and services that arguably are better or more distinctive or more relevant than what have been made in Guimarães over recent years. So there are challenges in the old economy or the more traditional economy. And Guimarães, like a lot of cities in Europe, has the scars to prove it. The post-industrial landscape, the empty factories, the dusty back streets with boarded up shops, a familiar sight all over Europe. But it also has a young demographic. It seems an old city with old industries, but it has a young demographic. There's a university, a strong, dynamic university. The population is actually relatively young. But there's a sense, though, that the city has a youthful population, but it's also quite conservative, quite traditional. There are issues around who owns the city. Why do you stay in the city? Why would you stay in the city? There's a huge issue around talent loss. A lot of young people are leaving. How do you retain talent, but also how do you attract and re-attract talent? Major challenge for the city. And it's a city also that is more diverse, becoming more diverse. Not as diverse as Prato, but it's a city where the demographic profile is very different to what it was a couple of generations ago. Do they own or feel a part of the city's cultural narrative? Do they feel that they have a role in placemaking? So overall, building up to capital of culture, geographically and culturally marginal. Real issues around long-term economic restructuring, issues around productivity, issues around long-term under and high unemployment, issues around who the city is for, who owns the identity of the city. And there are issues around how you build from having a pristine heritage tradition into something that actually has a wider set of relevances for a wider set of people. Because there's a danger, as there is often the case in older cities, almost of the museumification of the cultural landscape of the city. How do you ensure that city feels alive and relevant for tomorrow? So the opportunity of European Capital of Culture was to attend to some of these development issues. It was to explore what it means to be in and of Guimarães in the future. And ultimately, the mission of the process was to collectively reimagine the possibility of the city of Guimarães. And unlike a lot of capitals of culture, which put on a show and do a lot of big picture stuff, and there's always fireworks, the process here was about getting right to the heart of the matter, to be disruptive, experimental, ask questions, cross boundaries, to generate new types of ownership, new types of practice that in turn would help to recreate notions of what the city was for, where it was going, and it would actually recast notions of culture and creativity for that city in the future. So yes, they had their big events in heritage environments, the big spectacular things. They had all of those, big crowd events. But underpinning all of this was a whole long-term process of participatory planning, citizen engagement, developing new notions, ultimately, of cultural citizenship in terms of who owns the story of the city, who owns the future direction of the city. And as part of this, interestingly, I think, was a whole process of participatory branding, moving away from the quite dusty, old-school coat of arms identity of the city towards something that felt like it was open and engaging for the participants, the citizens of the city itself. So the process of open consultation to co-create a new logo, but also a new narrative for the city, which felt fresh and felt owned and felt loved by more people than the current identity of the city. So this play of different shields, which links back to a historical coat of arms, was reinterpreted in different ways, with the mantra or the phrase, "You are part of it." We are part of the whole process. And this was adopted and adapted in so many ways across the city, people reinterpreting the brand of the city, putting it into their shop windows, making new identities through active participation in the branding of the city. It shows, in a way, that branding doesn't have to be top-down, doesn't have to be commodifying the city. It can be engaging, it can be diverse, and it can be alive. And there were a lot of community programming. There was a whole process around educational engagement, working with people on their own terms, in their natural environments, in different spaces. There was a program of taking culture into domestic environments. Mi Casa es tu casa was around music and performance in people's houses, bringing a process of programming into the living room, into the kitchen, or into the backyards of different communities. So as a complement to, or almost as an antidote to those big scale productions you have in Capital of Culture, building new kinds of intimacy, new kinds of citizen engagement in more natural social environments. There was a process of pop-up activities, meanwhile space activities and old retail spaces, in the streets, in the squares where things things had started to deteriorate, where things were quiet, but also where there's a sense of ownership had been taken away from certain communities. So there was processes of commissioning work in the traditional cultural spaces of the city. These are the old leather tanning areas of the city, which became reimagined, new community gardens, new community performance spaces, again going beyond the mainstream and developing programming where there's a sense of local agency and local engagement across the spaces of the city. There are also, of course, big investments in new cultural infrastructure, building the infrastructure and the capacity for the future in the built environment, but also temporary cultural infrastructure to enable that growth of production that you need for a Capital of Culture program. So a process of experimentation, demonstrating new kinds of practice and the development of new relationships. And a lot of this is about cross-sector relationships, connecting the scientists in the university to the geeks and the artists that were out there in the independent cultural sector but felt disconnected from the city in terms of feeling an ownership for the culture of the city going forwards. Creative labs, international residencies, processes that brought together people from different disciplines. Fab Lab program, exploring ideas around what does it mean to be in a small city on the edge of Europe when you have the Internet of Things coming in the future or coming today. Fashion Hub, which is about connecting, building relationships between the traditional textile sector and the growing but vulnerable designer-maker fashion sector to build new kinds of value chain, to develop a new industry altogether, because the textile sector had fallen away from contemporary relationships with the designer-maker sector. So working with local fashion designers to build those relationships and to build regional collections based out of traditional skills that were contemporary and relevant, and also, ultimately, positioned the fashion sector as something that is possible in the future in that city, where many felt that it wasn't possible in the future in that city. And textiles. We launched a new textile biennial, which is actually currently on in Guimarães today until October this year, so go along and see what's happening. And this is around making the links between the traditional sector and the contemporary visual arts linked to the textile sector. So reimagining a future for the textile sector that isn't just the core business as it used to be, new ways of developing the textile sector. And altogether, this was a capital of culture process that did need to tick the boxes that all capital of culture need to do. It needed to be relevant at a European level. It needed to have large events. It needed to build audiences. But more than anything else, what it did, I think, most effectively, and what it means for other cities, whether they become capitals of culture or not, is that it actually created a new fabric, a new cultural fabric for the city, which is built on engagement, participation, and a sense of co-creation or co-ownership, which is vital, ultimately, for this creative city or cultural city agenda to flourish. Because if people don't feel engaged, and if the talent base isn't part of it, then ultimately the city won't succeed. So thank you very much.